The grand city of Thebes buzzed with excitement. It was the day of Princess Isetnofret's royal wedding to Prince Amenemhat, a union that the entire kingdom had been waiting for. The streets were lined with crowds, their faces bright with joy as they cheered for the couple who were destined to rule Egypt together. The palace was adorned with the finest flowers, and the scent of incense hung in the air. The princess, radiant in her golden gown, walked down the aisle, her heart swelling with happiness. She had dreamt of this day for years of becoming queen, standing by the side of her beloved prince. The future of Egypt seemed as bright as the sun itself, filled with promises of glory and peace. But even in the midst of the celebrations, there was a sense that something unseen lingered in the shadows. No one could have foreseen the storm that would soon darken this moment. As the ceremony continued, an old seer, whose name was whispered only in fear, stood among the guests. She gazed upon the couple with piercing eyes and murmured an ancient profession that would haunt the princess forever. "The bride who wears the crown will soon be cast into the dust," she spoke in a voice that sent a chill through the air. Guests turned to each other in confusion, dismissing her words as the ramblings of an old woman. The young princess, her face radiant with the light of the wedding, brushed aside the warning. Her joy drowned out the echo of the prophecy. But deep within, a tiny seed of unease took root, though no one, not even Isetnofret herself, could understand the depth of its meaning. It would be a mistake she would soon regret. The celebrations that followed were a grand spectacle. Music filled the halls. Dancers twirled in their elaborate costumes, and laughter echoed through the royal palace. Isetnofret and Amenemhat danced together as one, their love and ambition intertwined. She felt as though nothing could break the bond between them. Nothing could stop their dreams of ruling Egypt. The weight of the future seemed light upon her shoulders. She had everything: beauty, love, and a future bright with power. The people adored her, and her marriage to Amenemhat was seen as the perfect union of strength and wisdom. Little did she know, the very power she sought would be the one thing to betray her. In the midst of the revelry, a figure moved through the crowd, unnoticed. A man cloaked in dark robes, his face concealed in shadow. He watched with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the joy of the event. As he passed by, he whispered something to a trusted servant who nodded and hurried off. The air seemed to grow colder as the mysterious man's gaze lingered on the princess. There was something unsettling about him, something that made even the most seasoned courtiers feel uneasy. He was not an invited guest, and yet his presence could not be ignored. His quiet but ominous actions would soon send ripples through the palace, forever altering the course of Isetnofret's life. The wedding that had begun with such promise was about to become the catalyst for her tragic fall. Princess Isetnofret had never known a love like the one she shared with Prince Amenemhat. Their first meeting, under the canopy of stars on a warm evening, felt like destiny itself had crafted it. He was a man of strength and wisdom, admired by all of Egypt. She was a radiant beauty, destined for greatness. Their union had been foreseen long before their first glance. He was everything she had ever dreamed of in a husband. His eyes shone with intelligence, and his smile made her feel as though the entire world revolved around her. When he spoke, it was with conviction. And when they were together, time seemed to stand still. Their love was the kind that could bind an empire. Each letter exchanged during their courtship, each whispered word of affection, wove them closer together. Isetnofret believed they were unstoppable, bound by both love and fate. Their marriage would be the beginning of something legendary, a reign that would echo through the ages. Little did she know, The dreams they shared would soon shatter, and love would become something far darker. The day of their wedding arrived with great fanfare, unmatched by any other celebration in the kingdom. The streets were lined with golden banners, and the air was thick with the sound of joyful music. The people gathered, their hearts alight with hope, for the union of Nofret and Amenemhat signaled a new era of prosperity. The royal palace was transformed into a haven of elegance, with marble floors and walls adorned with delicate tapestries. Nofret, dressed in shimmering gold and white, was a vision of grace as she walked down the aisle, her heart pounding with anticipation. Prince Amenemhat, standing tall and proud, awaited her at the altar, his eyes locked onto hers with a fierce intensity. As they exchanged vows, the crowd cheered, and the palace echoed with the sound of their future triumphs. It was a perfect day, full of promise. Yet in the deepest corners of the palace, the whispers of jealousy and envy began to stir, unnoticed by the bride and groom. Beneath the gilded glamour of the ceremony, unseen forces were already at work, plotting a future that would tear their world apart. As she stood beside her husband, the weight of the crown felt lighter than she had imagined. Nofret believed that together with Amenemhat, she would shape the future of Egypt, bringing about a reign of unmatched peace and prosperity. As the queen, she would be revered not just as a ruler, but as a woman of wisdom, grace, and unparalleled power. She dreamed of monuments in her name, of statues that would immortalize her legacy for generations. But her vision went beyond mere luxury. She wanted to guide the people, ensure their happiness, and make Egypt a land of eternal glory. She saw herself as both a wife and a sovereign, a queen who would stand shoulder to shoulder with her husband, equally adored by the people. She believed her marriage to Amenemhat was the beginning of a dynasty that would stretch across millennia. In her mind, the throne was not just a place of authority, but a symbol of their shared purpose. Her ambitions burned bright and fierce, as she was determined to be remembered not just as a queen, but as a ruler of Egypt in her own right. But the deeper she sought to entwine herself with the power of the throne, the more she unknowingly set herself on a path where betrayal and tragedy would soon find her. Life in the palace was as grand as Nofret had imagined, though it was not without its challenges. The initial months of her reign were filled with the excitement of learning the intricacies of governance, meeting with advisors, overseeing the construction of new temples, and welcoming dignitaries from all over the world. She and Amenemhat ruled side by side, though it was clear that much of the power in the palace lay in the hands of the old counselors and nobles who had their own interests to protect. Nofret worked tirelessly to prove herself, making decisions that pleased the people and trying to establish a fair rule. However, the more she tried to exert influence, the more she realized how deep the currents of palace politics ran. Power was not simply a matter of will, it was also about manipulation and loyalty. Two things Nofret was still learning to navigate. Behind the facade of friendship and loyalty, rivalries simmered, and whispers of dissent were never far. The courtiers, ever watchful, tested her every move, eager to see if she truly had the strength to rule. Despite the challenges, Nofret believed in her heart that she was on the right path, that her rise to power would be unstoppable. But the palace was not what it seemed, and the dangers it held were just beginning to make themselves known. The grandeur of the palace soon grew less enchanting as an unsettling new presence arrived. A foreign dignitary, dressed in a cloak of midnight blue, arrived at the palace under the guise of a visiting ambassador. His name, Nabu, was spoken quietly by the servants, his reputation unknown to all but a few. Tall and slender with striking, sharp features, Nabu had an air of mystery surrounding him. He claimed to come from a distant land across the desert, a kingdom whose name even the scholars in Egypt scarcely knew. Isetnofret welcomed him as she would any royal guest, but something about him unsettled her. Nabu's eyes, dark as the night sky, seemed to look right through her, as if he saw more than the royal facade she presented to the world. His smooth, almost hypnotic voice held an unsettling calmness as he spoke of ancient customs, strange rituals, and distant legends that seemed to hold little connection to Egypt's grandeur. He often lingered near the court's most influential nobles, whispering into their ears. And Isetnofret soon learned that some of them were listening with an unusual intensity. No one seemed to know much about Nabu's past, and his cryptic conversations were beginning to cause unease among the court. Isetnofret, always careful and aware of the palace's politics, felt a strange pull toward him, an instinct she could not explain. But what she didn't realize was that Nabu wasn't simply a visitor. He was an agent of change, sent with a purpose that would soon unravel everything she had built. As weeks passed, the atmosphere in the palace began to shift. Whispers echoed through the corridors, fueled by jealousy and suspicion. The courtiers, once eager to serve their queen, began to show signs of resentment. Isetnofret's rise to power had not gone unnoticed, and her increasing influence in the palace had begun to draw the attention of those who had once been content with their roles in the shadow of her marriage to Amenemhat. Some nobles began to question her authority, mocking her youthful ambition. In hushed voices, they spoke of her in terms that undermined her legitimacy, suggesting that a woman, no matter how skilled or intelligent, was never meant to rule Egypt alongside her husband. Among these courtiers, Isetnofret's closest confidant, Lord Menkae, a wise and revered member of the council, began to distance himself. At first, his withdrawal was subtle delays in meetings, missing counsel, but soon it became clear that he was no longer the ally she once thought him to be. Isetnofret could feel the walls of her power beginning to close in. The nobles who had once celebrated her success now circled her like vultures, eager to discredit her. Some suggested that Amenemhat, weak in health and absent for long periods, would never be fit to rule. Rumors of her becoming a regent instead of a queen grew louder by the day. As Isetnofret began to hear these whispers, she could not ignore the gnawing sensation that something was terribly wrong in the palace. But she was too deep in the web of courtly politics to see the full extent of the betrayal. What she didn't know was that this growing discontent was not only within her court, it was being stoked by the mysterious Nabu, whose secret influence was already at work. One morning, the palace awoke to the shocking news that Pharaoh Amenemhat had fallen gravely ill. His body, once the picture of strength, had been struck by a sudden fever that rendered him weak and immobile. He had gone hunting, as was his custom, but when he returned from the desert, he was nothing like the man Isetnofret had married. The pharaoh's absence was like a great dark cloud over the palace. As the days passed, his condition worsened, and Isetnofret found herself forced into a role she never imagined. Without her husband's guidance, she had to make decisions she had never been prepared for. The weight of the crown now seemed unbearable. Ministers and advisors swarmed around her, offering suggestions and demands. Though her people loved her, Isetnofret felt the burden of every choice she made. She struggled to maintain control, but with the pharaoh's absence, a power vacuum began to grow. Her enemies, once subtle in their manipulations, began to show their true intentions. They saw her as vulnerable, an untested queen who lacked the strength to rule alone. To the outside world, Isetnofret continued to stand strong, her resolve unbroken. But deep within the palace walls, tensions were rising, and the courtiers' whispers had now turned into open disdain. Nabu's influence was spreading like a poison. His presence grew more frequent in the court, as he whispered in the ears of those who were once loyal to Isetnofret, pushing them toward rebellion. The throne, now teetering on the brink of chaos, seemed to be slipping out of her grasp. As Pharaoh Amenemhat's illness dragged on, the power dynamics in the palace began to shift more dramatically. Isetnofret had no choice but to take control, making decisions that affected the kingdom and its future. However, what she didn't realize was that her actions were being manipulated by unseen forces. Every step she took to strengthen her reign seemed to push her further into a trap. The court, once her domain, had been quietly taken over by those who worked against her nobles, priests, and advisors, who used her vulnerability to their advantage. Even her closest allies, like Lord Menki, began to speak out against her, claiming she was not fit to rule without her husband at her side. These whispers reached the ears of the people, and slowly, doubt began to creep into the minds of even the most loyal servants. Isetnofret's attempts to strengthen her position had inadvertently driven a wedge between her and the very people who had once supported her. But it wasn't until Nabu's influence truly took root that she realized the full extent of the betrayal. As Nabu continued to weave his web of lies, he sowed seeds of doubt in Amenemhat's health, claiming that the pharaoh's illness was not natural, but a result of an ancient curse tied to Isetnofret's bloodline. This insidious rumor spread throughout the palace like wildfire, and Isetnofret found herself battling a growing tide of suspicion. The more she tried to assert herself, the more she seemed to lose ground. Her world, once filled with hope and dreams of power, was crumbling. But the most dangerous seeds of betrayal had yet to sprout, and soon, the very palace she had once ruled would become her prison. It began with small, subtle changes. Isetnofret's orders, once executed without question, were now ignored or delayed. Servants who had once been her loyal attendants began to avoid her gaze, their eyes darting away when she passed by. Trusted officials began to offer their advice less frequently, and soon, even her closest friends began to withdraw. Isetnofret, ever vigilant, noticed the changes, but she could not understand why it was happening. One evening, she summoned the head of her royal guard to discuss a matter of security, only to find that he had disappeared without a trace. Her trusted maid, who had served her since childhood, was also missing. Even more troubling, Nabu seemed to be everywhere, his presence at her side in court, speaking on behalf of the royal family, and mingling with her enemies seemed too coincidental. He no longer hid his true intentions. He was no longer just a diplomat or ambassador. He was pulling the strings in the palace, and Isetnofret, once the queen of the court, was becoming an invisible figure in her own domain. The signs were clear. Nowhere imprisonment had begun. The walls of her own palace were closing in, and she was trapped in a web of lies, betrayal, and manipulation. It happened without warning. Isetnofret had spent days poring over the kingdom's affairs, balancing her royal duties with the rising whispers of discontent. But one evening, as she was preparing for a private council meeting, the doors to her chambers burst open. Guards once loyal to her now stood at attention, their eyes cold and devoid of the warmth they had once shown. They seized her with brutal force, and before she could even comprehend what was happening, a harsh voice echoed through the halls. "By the decree of Pharaoh Amenemhat, you are under arrest for treason." Isetnofret's heart raced as her world crumbled around her. "Treason? What is this madness?" she demanded. but her voice faltered as the room seemed to spin. The guards did not answer. They bound her wrists, dragging her toward the throne room, where her fate was already being decided. In the depths of her mind, she had suspected something was wrong, but to be accused of treason by her own husband, the very pharaoh she had sworn to stand beside, was unthinkable. Yet the courtroom was cold, filled with officials who once spoke her praises, now silent as stone. Her eyes searched for Amenemhat, but he was nowhere to be found. And then, in a moment that would forever alter her life, Lord Menki, her once loyal advisor, stepped forward, reading aloud the charges against her, charges she had never imagined. A conspiracy to overthrow the pharaoh. "You are a danger to the throne," he declared, his voice unwavering. The weight of the words shattered Setnofret's heart. It was clear now. She had been betrayed, not just by the court, but by her own husband. Her royal status was stripped away in an instant, and the woman who had once been adored by the people was now nothing more than a prisoner. The grand robes she wore for court were torn from her, replaced with the tattered rags of a common servant. The cold stone of the dungeon was where she would be held, not the iron chambers of the queen. As she was thrust into the cell, Setnofret could feel her dignity slipping away with every harsh shove. The guards, who once obeyed her every command, now turned their backs and mocked her as they locked the cell door behind her. Tears of rage and confusion burned in her eyes, but she swallowed them down. The humiliation was far worse than the physical chains that bound her. The betrayal of those she trusted, her closest allies, her husband, her kingdom, was a blow she could not recover from. Outside the stone walls, the people celebrated, believing that their queen had finally fallen from grace. They rejoiced, ignorant of the truth, while Setnofret, stripped of her title and power, was left to languish in the darkness. In the silence of her confinement, she was forced to confront the truth. She was not just imprisoned in a cell, but in the very palace she had once ruled. It was not until days later that Nebu finally revealed his true nature. He appeared in the dungeon, standing tall and confident, his dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "So, the mighty queen has fallen," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Setnofret's pulse quickened as she recognized him not as a diplomat, but as the orchestrator of her downfall. The calm and charismatic foreigner had been playing his part all along, weaving a web of lies and deceit. He smiled darkly, enjoying the sight of her despair. "You were never meant to rule, Setnofret. The gods did not choose you," he continued, his words cutting deep. "Your bloodline is tainted, your destiny unworthy of the throne." The revelation hit her like a wave crashing against rocks. Nabu was no mere ambassador. He was a member of an ancient faction that believed the bloodline of pharaohs was cursed, and that only a pure line, untouched by the sins of the past, could rule Egypt. He had been working from the shadows, manipulating the court and twisting the truth, convincing Amenemhat's closest advisors that Setnofret's reign was an abomination. His influence had poisoned the very palace she had ruled with love and hope. The betrayal was complete. Nabu, the man who had seemed so trustworthy, had been the architect of her ruin. And now, with the pharaoh's illness and her imprisonment, he had successfully replaced her with a puppet ruler who would serve his own dark purposes. "Your fall was inevitable," Nabu said with finality, turning to leave her in her cage. "The throne was never yours to claim." The door slammed shut, and for the first time since her capture, Setnofret felt true despair. She had been a pawn in a game far larger than she could have ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, as Isetnofret languished in the dungeon. But the final act of betrayal was yet to come. A grand spectacle was planned at her public execution. The court had decided that the best way to rid themselves of the unfit queen was to make an example of her, to send a message to anyone who dared oppose the new order. Isetnofret was dragged from her cell, her once proud form now gaunt and weak. The entire city gathered in the courtyard as she was brought to the stage, shackled and humiliated. The crowd was silent as they watched their fallen queen stand before them, her eyes filled with defiance. She refused to cry, to show weakness. She would face her end with dignity, even if it meant the end of everything she had once fought for. But as the blade was raised, ready to strike, something unexpected happened. In that instant, a great commotion erupted in the crowd. An uprising, led by those who still remembered her greatness, swept through the palace gates. Isetnofret's loyal servants, those who had not betrayed her, broke through the guards and rushed to free her. Chaos erupted, and in the confusion, the execution was stopped. But Isetnofret's fate was far from secure. As she was whisked away in the chaos, she knew that the danger was far from over. She had narrowly escaped death, but she was now a fugitive in her own kingdom, her position shattered beyond repair. Isetnofret had been given a second chance at life, but it came at an unimaginable cost. Once a queen, adored and respected, she's now a shadow of her former self. The grand halls she had once walked with grace now seemed foreign to her, a place where only whispers filled the air. Stripped of her royal status, Isetnofret was reduced to a common servant, forced to live in the very palace that had once been hers. Her once beautiful chambers were now occupied by others, and the servants who had once bowed to her now treated her with disdain, avoiding her gaze whenever she passed by. Every step she took in the palace was a reminder of what she had lost: her dignity, her title, her power. Yet, there was still a fire inside her, a quiet anger that burned through the veil of humiliation. She had been broken, yes, but not defeated. As she worked in silence, cleaning the very floors she had once ruled from, Isetnofret's mind never ceased its plotting. She would never forget the faces of those who had betrayed her Amenemhat, who had turned his back on her, and Nabu, the architect of her downfall. They had stripped her of her crown, but they had not taken her spirit. In the depths of the palace, far from the gaze of her enemies, Isetnofret began to gather her strength once more. She would rise again, but she knew it would not be in the way the courtiers expected. Though Isetnofret had been reduced to a mere servant, her mind was still sharp, and she quickly realized that in her new position, she could gather the very information she would need to regain her power. She began to listen carefully to the servants who passed through the halls, overhearing their conversations about the palace and the court. She learned of Nabu's growing influence, his control over the pharaoh, and how he had begun to manipulate the royal advisors to serve his own dark purposes. But she also learned of the discontent among the lower ranks. There were still those who remembered the queen she had been, who believed she had been unjustly cast aside. Slowly, carefully, Isetnofret began to plant seeds of loyalty among the servants who had once been loyal to her. In secret, she whispered of her plans to those who would listen, promising them that the day would come when she would take back what was rightfully hers. She learned of the pharaoh's worsening health, of the political instability that followed his condition. The court was divided. Some believed Amenemhat was dying, while others believed he had been poisoned. Isetnofret could feel the winds of change stirring. With every secret she uncovered, every loyal servant she gathered, her plans took shape. She would no longer be a prisoner in her own palace. She would be the one to decide her fate. Though she appeared to be nothing more than a humble servant, Isetnofret never lost her connection to the power that flowed through the veins of her bloodline. As she moved through the palace, unnoticed and unseen, she began to gather knowledge not just about the palace's politics, but about the secret alliances, the betrayals that had been quietly taking place around her. She learned that Amenemhat's health had been deteriorating for some time, and Nabu's influence had been quietly pushing for his eventual replacement. But what Nabu did not know was that the people were beginning to see through his machinations. Whispers of rebellion grew louder as Isetnofret's loyalists started to speak out in the shadows, rallying against Nabu and his supporters. The palace, once a fortress of deception, was beginning to show cracks, and in those cracks, Isetnofret saw an opportunity. The palace guards, once under the sway of Nabu, were slowly realizing that they had been manipulated into betraying their true queen. It would take time, but with every ally she gained, her plan grew more certain. Isetnofret would not be the servant for long. As the days passed, she quietly prepared for the moment when she would take back the throne, using all the knowledge she had gained from her time in the shadow. The palace might have stripped her of her power, but it had not taken away her ability to command the hearts of those who still remembered her as their queen. The tables would soon turn, and when they did, Nabu's influence would crumble. Isetnofret's moment of redemption came when she least expected it. The pharaoh's health had worsened, and rumors of his death had begun to spread through the palace like wildfire. Nabu, ever the opportunist, had begun to make his move, positioning himself to take control of Egypt. He thought he had won, had believed that Isetnofret was broken beyond repair, a mere shadow of the woman she had once been. But he had underestimated her. The day came when Nabu called for a grand assembly in the throne room, a final declaration of his dominance over the court. The nobles, eager to align themselves with the new power, filled the room, awaiting Nabu's triumphant rise to the throne. But when the doors opened, it was not Nabu who entered, but Isetnofret. The courtiers turned in shock, their faces pale with disbelief. She stood tall, regal even in the tattered dress of a servant. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow, now burned with determination. "The throne was never yours to take," she said, her voice strong and clear. The room fell silent as Isetnofret walked to the front of the hall, her presence commanding the attention of every soul in the room. With a single motion, she gestured to the pharaoh's weakened form, now barely able to stand. "You've played your games, Nabu, but Egypt will never bow to a traitor," she declared. The guards who had once been loyal to Nabu now turned to Isetnofret, recognizing the true ruler in her. With her loyalists at her side, she seized the moment. Nabu, realizing his fate had been sealed, attempted to flee, but he was captured before he could escape the palace. The false ruler was brought to justice, his plans shattered, and the people who had once doubted Isetnofret's strength now celebrated her return to power. With Nabu gone, Isetnofret reclaimed her rightful place beside Amenemhat, who, though gravely ill, understood that his time had passed. Together, they would restore Egypt to its former glory. But Isetnofret would never forget the lessons of her fall. Her power, now unchallenged, would be used wisely, not just for the people of Egypt, but for herself. Her reign would be one of strength, resilience, and the quiet knowledge that no betrayal could break the spirit of a true ruler. Neferet held the golden scarab amulet in her trembling hands. It was small but heavy, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the dim light of her chamber. As she stared at it, the amulet began to glow softly, casting a warm yet eerie light across her face. Then came the whisper-soft, raspy voices that no one else could hear. They spoke in riddles, their words slithering into her mind like smoke. "He walks among you," the voices hissed, "but his soul belongs to the gods." Neferet gasped and nearly dropped the amulet. Her heart raced as she realized the whispers were talking about Ankmat, her husband. She clutched the artifact tightly, her mind swirling with questions. What did it mean? Was her beloved truly more than human? Neferet sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the glowing amulet. Lately, things about Ankmat had been unsettling her. He always seemed so calm, even when chaos erupted around him. Just last week, he had healed a child's fever with just a touch, something no ordinary man could do. And then there was the strangest thing of all: he never cast a shadow, no matter how bright the sun shone. These oddities gnawed at her mind, filling her with doubt. Yet, despite her fears, she loved him deeply. How could someone so kind and gentle be anything other than mortal? The conflict tore at her heart, leaving her unsure whether to trust her instincts or dismiss her worries as silly superstitions. Neferet's thoughts drifted back to the day she married Ankmat. It had been a grand celebration, filled with laughter, music, and the sweet scent of lotus flowers. The sky above Thebes had been clear and blue, perfect for the sacred ceremony. But just as the high priest raised his hands to bless their union, the wind picked up suddenly. A fierce sandstorm swept through the city, forcing everyone to take cover. Guests screamed and scrambled for shelter, their colorful robes flapping wildly in the gusts. When Neferet looked up, she saw falcons circling overhead, their sharp cries cutting through the chaos. Their shadows danced across the altar, dark and fleeting, like warnings from the gods. The priests exchanged worried glances, muttering prayers under their breath. Even then, Neferet had felt a chill run down her spine. Something about that day had felt wrong. Now, holding the whispering amulet, she wondered if the omens had been trying to tell her something all along. Neferet remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell when she was a child. Tales of gods walking among mortals, disguised as ordinary people to test humanity's worthiness. Some were kind and brought blessings, while others sought to punish those who strayed from divine laws. Her grandmother's voice would grow soft and serious as she warned, "Beware the signs, for they may reveal truths too great for mortal hearts to bear." At the time, Neferet had dismissed these tales as mere legends meant to entertain. But now, as she connected the dots between Ankmat's peculiar behavior and the amulet's cryptic message, those old stories didn't seem so far-fetched. Could her husband truly be one of the gods? And if he was, what did it mean for her and for their future together? Overwhelmed by fear and curiosity, Neferet knew she couldn't ignore the amulet's warning any longer. Clutching it tightly in her hand, she vowed to uncover the truth, no matter where it led her. If Ankmat was indeed a god, she needed to understand why he had chosen her and what destiny awaited them both. Taking a deep breath, she stood up, her resolve hardening. She would confront him not just as his wife, but as a seeker of truth. Perhaps the answers lay beyond the veil of mortality, in realms only the gods could tread. Whatever the cost, Neferet was ready to face it. The city of Thebes sparkled under the golden rays of Ra, its temples gleaming like jewels against the endless desert sands. Along the banks of the Nile, markets buzzed with life. Merchants called out to passers-by, their stalls filled with vibrant fabrics, fragrant spices, and shimmering jewelry. Children ran barefoot through the streets, laughing as they chased one another beneath the watchful eyes of towering statues carved in honor of the gods. Pyramids rose majestically in the distance, their peaks piercing the horizon like fingers reaching for eternity. Every corner of Thebes carried whispers of divinity, Priests chanted prayers in shadowy sanctuaries, while farmers gave thanks to Osiris for bountiful harvests. Even the simplest tasks, drawing water from the river or weaving baskets, were done with reverence for the unseen forces that shaped their lives. It was a place where mortals walked hand in hand with the mysteries of the gods, never knowing when divine intervention might alter their fate. Yet amidst this beauty and devotion, there lingered an undercurrent of unease, as if the gods themselves were watching closely, waiting for something or someone to tip the balance. Neferet stood at the edge of the sacred lake, her reflection rippling gently on its surface. She had always felt drawn to the divine, especially to Isis, the goddess of wisdom and magic. Each morning, she prayed before dawn, lighting incense and reciting ancient hymns passed down by her ancestors. Her teachers praised her dedication, but lately her mind wandered during rituals. Her thoughts drifted often to Ankmat, her husband, whose presence seemed both comforting and unsettling. Neferet loved him deeply, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he held secrets too vast for mortal understanding. At night, she pored over scrolls about prophecies and sacred rites, searching for answers. Some spoke of gods walking among humans, disguised as ordinary people. Others warned of trials that would test even the purest hearts. These tales stirred a curiosity within Hera, longing to uncover truths hidden just beyond reach. Though torn between her duty to the gods and her love for Ankmat, Neferet knew one thing for certain: the path ahead would not be easy. But she also sensed that it was hers alone to walk. Ankmat's rise, from humble scribe to nobleman, had been swift and unexpected. Once, he had spent his days hunched over clay tablets, recording grain counts and temple offerings. Now, he moved through the halls of power with quiet confidence, his calm demeanor masking an aura of mystery. People whispered about how he had earned Pharaoh's favor so quickly. Some said it was his sharp intellect. Others claimed it was luck. But there was more to Ankmat than met the eye. His voice carried a weight that made listeners pause, as though each word carried meaning far deeper than its surface. When he smiled, it was warm yet distant, like sunlight filtering through thick clouds. Those who tried to get close found themselves uneasy, unable to explain why. Despite this, many admired Hymeeve and envied him for his poise and charm. To Neferet, however, Ankmat was simply her husband. Still, she noticed things others missed. There was a stillness about him, as if he existed slightly apart from the world around him. And though she loved him dearly, this growing sense of separation gnawed at her heart. Within the temple of Amun-Ra, whispers spread like wildfire. The priesthood watched Ankmat closely, their suspicions growing with every passing day. How could a mere scribe ascend so quickly? Why did his presence seem to silence even the wind? They exchanged worried glances during ceremonies, muttering prayers to ward off curses. Some believed Ankmat was cursed, marked by dark magic meant to destroy Thebes from within. Others thought him blessed, sent by the gods to fulfill some unknown purpose. Either way, they agreed on one thing: he was dangerous. Their leader, High Priest Setka, called for an emergency council. "We must act," he declared, his voice low but urgent. "If he is indeed touched by the gods, we risk angering them by interfering. But if he is cursed," he let the sentence hang, leaving the rest unsaid. Neferet began noticing strange things about Ankmat. On sunny afternoons, when everyone else cast long shadows, his silhouette remained absent, as though swallowed by light itself. Once, she saw him touch a child's scraped knee, and the wound vanished instantly, leaving smooth skin behind. Most unsettling were his words. He spoke often of eternity, of cycles beyond mortal comprehension, as if he saw time differently than others. These peculiarities weighed heavily on Neferet's mind. She wanted to believe they were harmless quirks, but deep down, she feared they pointed to something greater and, perhaps darker. Rumors swirled through the city, fueled by frightened whispers. Some claimed Ankh-Mat was a god in disguise. Others called him a demon. Whatever the truth, Neferet knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. As Neferet sat alone in their home, clutching the golden scarab amulet gifted to her on her wedding day, she faced a question that haunted her dreams. Should she uncover the truth about Ankh-Mat, no matter the cost? Or should she protect Hemand herself from whatever dangers lay hidden? The stakes were clear. Revealing the truth could save him or doom them both. With trembling hands, she traced the amulet's intricate carvings, feeling its faint warmth against her palm. Outside, the wind howled softly, carrying whispers of prophecy. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. The choice before her loomed large, heavy with uncertainty. Neferet's heart pounded as she slipped through the heavy wooden doors of the Temple of Hathor. The air inside was cool and damp, filled with the scent of ancient parchment and incense. She had been drawn here by whispers in her dream-soft voices, urging her to seek answers hidden within these forbidden archives. Her torch flickered, casting long shadows on the stone walls as she moved deeper into the dimly lit chamber. Finally, she found what she was looking for, a dusty scroll tucked away in a corner, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly under the light. As she unrolled it, her hands trembled. The prophecy spoke of a god descending to earth in human form to restore balance, but at great personal cost. It warned of trials that would test not only the divine being, but also those who loved them. Neferet felt a chill run down her spine. Was this about Ankh-Mat? Her mind raced with questions. What kind of trials awaited him? And how could she protect him if he truly was more than mortal? Despite her fear, determination burned within her. She knew she couldn't turn back now. Clutching the scroll tightly, she made a silent vow to uncover the truth, no matter where it led her. The festival of Osiris brought joy and color to Thebes. Streets overflowed with music, laughter, and offerings to honor the god of the afterlife. But amidst the celebration, something extraordinary happened. A massive crocodile emerged from the Nile, thrashing wildly and terrifying the worshippers gathered near the riverbank. Just as panic began to spread, Ankh-Mat stepped forward. He raised his hand, and the beast froze mid-motion before retreating calmly into the water. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Later that day, news spread of another miracle. A deadly plague sweeping through the city suddenly vanished after Ankh-Mat visited the sick. Then came the storm, of fierce tempest that threatened to destroy crops and homes. With a single command, Ankh-Mat parted the clouds, allowing sunlight to pour through once again. While many cheered and praised him as a hero, others whispered uneasily among themselves. How could a mere mortal perform such feats? Neferet watched silently from the sidelines, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe her husband was simply blessed by the gods, but doubt gnawed at her. Each miracle deepened her suspicions, leaving her torn between awe and fear. The priesthood of Amun-Ra wasted no time in convening an emergency council. Their faces were grim as they discussed Ankh-Mat's recent actions. "This is blasphemy," one priest declared, slamming his fist on the table. "No mortal should wield such power. He mocks the gods." Murmurs of agreement echoed around the room. Another priest suggested a solution: the trial of Ma'at. Only the gods themselves could pass this sacred test. where a person's heart was weighed against the feather of truth. If Ankmat failed, it would prove he was nothing more than a fraud or worse, cursed. Word of the accusation spread quickly through Thebes. Some citizens rallied behind Ankmat, convinced he was sent by the gods to save them. Others grew fearful, believing his powers might bring destruction upon the city. Tension simmered like heat rising off the desert sands. Neferet listened to the arguments swirling around her, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. She knew the trial would decide not only Ankmat's fate, but possibly hers as well. Alone in her chamber, Neferet sat cross-legged on the floor, tears streaming down her face. Her mind was a battlefield, torn between love and duty. On one side stood Ankmat, the man she adored, the father of her children, the center of her world. On the other stood her role as a priestess, sworn to uphold divine law and protect Thebes from any threat, even if it meant turning against her own husband. She thought back to their wedding day, the promises they had made to each other. Had she truly married a man, or did she unknowingly bind herself to a deity? The question haunted her every waking moment. In desperation, she prayed to Isis, pleading for guidance. "Goddess of wisdom, show me the way," she whispered, clutching her amulet. "Help me understand what I must do." For hours, she remained there, wrestling with her thoughts. By the time dawn broke, her resolve had hardened. Whatever the truth about Ankmat, she vowed to stand by him not just as his wife, but as his ally. As preparations for the trial of Ma'at began, alliances shifted throughout Thebes. Some priests secretly supported Ankmat, believing him to be a gift from the gods. They approached Neferet, offering their aid and vowing to defend him during the trial. Others, however, plotted against him, spreading rumors and sowing distrust in the people. Neferet became a key figure in rallying allies. Armed with the knowledge of the prophecy, she argued passionately on Ankmat's behalf, convincing even skeptics that his powers were meant to restore balance, not harm. Despite her efforts, suspicion lingered in the air, like smoke after a fire. Suspense built as the date of the trial drew near. Both sides braced for a confrontation that could alter the fate of Thebes forever. For Neferet, the stakes had never been higher. She clung to hope, praying that love and truth would prevail over fear and doubt. The hall of judgment was silent, except for the faint hum of divine energy that filled the air. Ankmat stood at the center, his figure illuminated by the golden glow of the sacred scales. Around him, the gods Thoth, Anubis, and Horus watched with unblinking eyes, their presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The room felt heavy, as if the weight of eternity rested on every breath. Anubis stepped forward, his jackal-headed form casting long shadows across the chamber. With careful precision, he placed Ankmat's heart onto one side of the scale. On the other side lay the feather of truth, shimmering like sunlight on water. Neferet watched from the shadows, her hands clasped tightly together. Her lips moved in silent prayer to Isis, though her voice seemed swallowed by the vastness of the hall. The scales wavered, trembling under the weight of Ankmat's soul. For a moment, it seemed the feather might tip upward. But then, the balance steadied. A low murmur rippled through the crowd gathered outside the hall. Something about this man or god was extraordinary. Neferet's heart raced. She didn't know what the outcome would mean, but she could feel the truth hanging precariously in the air, waiting to be revealed. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from the scales, flooding the hall with brilliance. Gasps echoed as visions began to unfold before everyone's eyes. They saw worlds taking shape, stars being born, and life itself being breathed into existence. It was Ptah, the creator god, shaping the universe with steady hands. The images shifted, showing Ptah descending to earth, walking among mortals, and sharing in their joys and sorrows. Ptah says what she was seeing. This wasn't just Ankmat. The man she had loved and lived with it was Ptah, a deity who had chosen mortality to understand the struggles of humanity. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized the depth of his sacrifice. How could she have missed the signs? His calm demeanor, his miracles, his absence of a shadow wall pointed to something far greater than she had ever imagined. The crowd outside murmured in awe, some falling to their knees in reverence. But not everyone was pleased. Among the priests, anger simmered. If this man truly was a god, then their authority was threatened. Whispers turned to shouts as they demanded justice, claiming no mortal or immortal should wield such power unchecked. Enraged by the revelation, the high priest Setka raised his staff, chanting forbidden spells in a language older than time itself. Shadows swirled around him, growing darker and denser until they formed a massive cloud that loomed over the hall. The air grew cold and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Bolts of dark energy shot toward Ankmat, seeking to banish him from the mortal realm. Neferet couldn't stand idly by. Clutching her amulet, she stepped forward, her voice ringing out with desperate courage. "Isis, protect us!" she cried. In an instant, radiant light burst forth from the amulet, clashing violently with the encroaching darkness. The two forces collided in midair, sending shockwaves rippling through the chamber. Sparks flew, illuminating the night sky above the temple as gods and mortals alike held their breath. The battle raged on, each side refusing to yield. Neferet felt the strain of channeling divine power, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she refused to give up. Her love for Ankmatan, now for Ptah, fueled her resolve. Finally, with one last surge of energy, the light overwhelmed the shadows, scattering them into nothingness. The priests fell back, their faces pale with fear. Silence returned to the hall, broken only by the sound of Neferet's ragged breathing. As the dust settled, all eyes turned to Ptah. He stood tall, his expression calm yet sorrowful. The gods acknowledged his identity, urging him to return to the heavens where he belonged. "Your place is with us," Horus declared, his voice echoing like thunder. "Reclaim your eternal power." But Ptah hesitated. His gaze drifted to Neferet, who stood nearby, tears streaming down her face. She took a step closer, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Please don't leave me," she whispered. "Stay for love, for us." Ptah closed his eyes, reflecting on his journey. He thought of the suffering he had witnessed, the lives he had touched, and the love he had found with Neferet. Was it worth giving up eternity for a single lifetime bound by human frailty? Yet, as he looked at her, he knew the answer. Love was a force stronger than any divine power. With a deep sigh, he made his decision. Turning to the gods, he spoke firmly. "I choose to remain here, among mortals. My purpose is fulfilled, and my heart belongs to this world." Neferet collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. Though she knew challenges still lay ahead, she also knew they would face them together. The gods nodded solemnly, acknowledging Ptah's sacrifice. They blessed him and sealed away the dark forces, unleashed by the priesthood, ensuring peace would return to Thebes. As dawn broke, golden sunlight spilled into the hall, bathing Neferet and Ptah in its warmth. Hand in hand, they stepped out into the new day, ready to forge a path that blended divinity and humanity. Though the road ahead would not be easy, they faced it with hope and determination. Together, they had proven that love could transcend even the boundaries of mortality. And so, Their story became legend, tale of sacrifice, faith, and the enduring power of love. As dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Ta stood at the edge of the sacred lake, his form glowing faintly with divine light. Nefret approached him slowly, her heart heavy but full of love. She knew this moment had come, the time for him to return to the heavens. With a gentle smile, he reached out and placed his hand on her forehead. A rush of visions flooded her mind, images of stars being born, rivers carving through deserts, and lives intertwined by fate. These were gifts of wisdom, meant to guide her in his absence. Their final embrace was tender yet bittersweet, filled with unspoken words and shared memories. Tears streamed down Neferet's face as she clung to him, knowing their bond would transcend even the boundaries of mortality. Then, with one last glance, Ptah stepped back and ascended into the sky, leaving behind only a faint shimmer where he had stood. In the days that followed, Neferet felt the weight of her loss like a stone pressing against her chest. Yet amidst her grief, something stirred within her, a spark of purpose, ignited by Ptah's sacrifice. She began dedicating herself fully to her role as a priestess, pouring her pain into teaching others about the lessons she had learned. Her voice carried both strength and compassion as she spoke of the duality of mortals and gods. "We are fragile," she told her students, "but our spirits can touch eternity if we live with love and faith." Her teachings spread far beyond Thebes, becoming stories passed down through generations. People came from distant lands to hear her speak, drawn by the depth of her wisdom and the sincerity of her message. Over time, Neferet transformed her sorrow into reverence, honoring Ta not just as a god, but as the man who had taught her what it meant to truly love. Under the silver glow of the moon, Neferet often sat by the sacred lake, reflecting on the mysteries of life. She thought of how mortal hearts beat so fiercely, yet how fleeting their time on earth truly was. And she marveled at the power of the divine, whose presence could shape destinies without ever being seen. "Life is a balance," she mused aloud one night, her voice soft but steady. "Between the fragile and the eternal, the seen and the unseen, we are all threads in a grand tapestry woven by forces greater than ourselves." These reflections became part of her teachings, offering listeners a glimpse into the harmony between humanity and divinity. Through her words, they found solace in the interconnectedness of all things, a reminder that even in fragility there is beauty. Nefret often ended her lessons with a simple truth: even gods must walk among mortals to truly understand love, sacrifice, and the fragility of life. This insight resonated deeply with those who heard it, reminding them that no matter how powerful or small someone might seem, everyone shares the same struggles and triumphs. "Love," she explained, "was the bridge between worlds that connected mortals to gods and bound hearts across lifetimes. Sacrifice, too, held immense power, shaping destinies in ways no one could foresee." Her words inspired many to approach life with humility, empathy, and gratitude, knowing that every action carried meaning far beyond what the eye could see. As the years passed, Neferet's legacy grew, leaving an indelible mark on the people of Thebes. Her story invited listeners to reflect on their own lives and the unseen forces that guided them and the choices they made along the way. How did faith shape their paths? Could love truly transcend even death? These questions lingered long after her lessons ended, sparking conversations around campfires and in temples. For some, the answers brought comfort. For others, they sparked curiosity. But one thing was certain: Neferet's tale reminded everyone that destiny was never solely in human hands and that love, above all else, was the most enduring force of all. The great temple of Anubis loomed in the darkness, its towering statues casting long shadows across the stone floor. The scent of burning incense choked the air, mingling with the faint, lingering stench of death. Meredith moved like a phantom through the temple halls, her golden robes trailing behind her, the hem stained with dirt and tears. She had not come as a queen tonight. She had come as a desperate woman. Her heart pounded as she reached the altar, her knees hitting the cold stone floor. Above her, the massive black jackal statue of Anubis towered in silence, its carved eyes gleaming under the dim torchlight. The god of death, the keeper of souls. Fear clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to speak, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Great Anubis, hear my plea." Silence stretched around her, thick and suffocating. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I offer myself, my soul, anything. Just save him. Save Kemet." Her voice cracked, a single tear slipping down her cheek. No mortal should dare seek the god of death. The price is too high, the priests had warned her, but she had no choice. Her kingdom was falling, her husband lay dying. If the gods would not listen, then she would turn to the one who ruled over the souls they abandoned. Beyond the temple walls, the once mighty kingdom of Kemet crumbled. The Nile, the lifeblood of the land, had begun to recede. Its once mighty currents reduced to a sluggish trickle. Famine gripped the villages, children crying from hunger as their mothers prayed to silent gods. Crops withered under the merciless sun. The palace, once a beacon of prosperity, now sat beneath a sky choked with the smoke of distant battles. Invaders threatened the borders, and the high priests whispered of omen shadows moving where there should be none. Unnatural deaths sweeping through the city, a curse upon the land. The gods had turned their backs. But worse than war, worse than famine, was the illness that had taken the pharaoh her pharaoh. Mentuhotep, the great ruler of Kemet, the man she had loved and sworn to stand beside, lay wasting away in his bedchamber. His once powerful frame had withered to mere skin and bone, his breath shallow, his skin pallid and cold. No healer could explain it, and no prayer could cure it. His soul was slipping, being dragged into the abyss by unseen hands. Meredith had exhausted every sacred rite, every offering, every desperate plea to the gods of the sun, the river, and the sky. None had answered. There was only one left to call. A chill slithered through the temple, curling around Meredith like unseen fingers. The flames of the torches flickered, bending unnaturally toward the altar. Then, a voice, low, ancient, amused. "You dare call upon me?" The sound was not human. It seeped from the shadows like mist, thick and suffocating, wrapping around her like a living thing. Neferura's breath caught in her throat as the air in the temple shifted. The shadows deepened. A shape emerged from the darkness beyond the altar. Two golden eyes, gleaming like molten metal, cut through the gloom. A towering figure stepped forward, his form shifting between man and beast, draped in obsidian robes that swallowed the light. The jackal-headed god of death, Anubis. His gaze bore into her, his jackal snout curling into something resembling amusement. A queen who would trade her soul. How interesting. The temple trembled. The gods had ignored her. But death had answered. The land of Kemet was dying. Once the kingdom had thrived under the watchful eyes of the gods, its golden fields stretching far beyond the horizon, the Nile overflowing with life. Now, the river had shrunk to a feeble trickle. Its once strong currents slowed as if gasping for breath. The earth had cracked under the merciless sun, crops withering to dust before they could bear fruit. The people, once proud, once prosperous, wandered the streets with hollow eyes and empty bellies. Mothers whispered prayers over their starving children, hoping for a sign that the gods still listened. But the gods had fallen silent. Beyond the palace walls, the villages teetered on the edge of ruin. Temples once filled with music and offerings now stood in eerie quiet, their priests afraid to speak the truth. Kemet was cursed. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some blamed the foreign invaders, who burned fields and pillaged sacred shrines. Others spoke of ominous unnatural deaths, strange shadows flickering in the streets at dusk, the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the dark. Fear had become a living thing, creeping through the kingdom like a beast waiting to devour them all. Inside the palace, the heart of Kemet's suffering lay upon a gilded bed, surrounded by silent attendants and anxious priests. Pharaoh Mentuhotep, the ruler of the land, the man once revered as a living god, had become a shadow of himself. His once powerful body had withered, his skin growing pale, almost translucent. His breath came in slow, ragged gasps, each one weaker than the last. The greatest healers in Kemet had tried everything: sacred herbs, spells carved into gold, prayers offered at every temple in the city, but nothing could touch the sickness that had stolen the pharaoh's strength. It was as if something unseen, something unnatural, was pulling his soul away, piece by piece. Meritneith sat beside him, gripping his hand, her fingers brushing against skin that had grown too cold. This was not a simple illness. She had seen men struck down by disease, but this was different. It felt as if death itself was standing in the room, waiting, watching. The priests muttered among themselves, their faces drawn in fear. She could see it in their eyes. They believed it too. This was no ordinary fate. This was a punishment, a curse. She looked at her husband's face, at the man she had loved for so many years. He was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she was powerless to stop it. She had begged the gods for mercy, had given offerings, had knelt before every altar in Kemet, but there had been no answer. There was only silence. Meritneith had always been a woman of faith, a queen who honored the gods, who upheld the sacred laws of the land. But faith had done nothing to save her people. Faith had left her husband dying. And so, when the whispers reached her ears, whispers of an ancient power, of a God who did not turn away from desperate souls, she listened. The old texts spoke of him, hidden away in forbidden scrolls deep within the royal archives. Anubis, the god of the dead, the keeper of lost souls, the one who walked the line between life and oblivion. His name was feared, spoken only in hushed tones by those who dared to believe in his power. The high priests warned against him. They said he only answered when the price was too high, that those who sought him never returned the same. She did not care. If the gods of light had abandoned her, then she would turn to the god of shadows. The temple was empty when she arrived, the night's darkness pressing against its stone walls like an unwelcome guest. The torches flickered as if they too feared what was to come. Meritneith moved with purpose, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous hall. She had read the ritual in an ancient scroll, words written in ink so old it had nearly faded to nothing. She knew what had to be done. With steady hands, she approached the altar. A bronze dagger lay before her, its blade inscribed with sacred markings. She picked it up, the weight of it heavy in her palm. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the sharp edge against her skin. A thin line of crimson bloomed across her palm, droplets of blood pooling and falling onto the cold stone below. She whispered the incantation, her voice steady, unwavering. The language was old, older than the temples, older than the gods who had forsaken her. The air around her thickened, the torches dimming as a deep, unnatural silence filled the temple. Then, the shadows began to move. A gust of cold air rushed through the chamber, snuffing out the flames one by one. The darkness was alive, shifting, twisting, crawling toward her. And then a voice, low, deep, ancient, amused. "You dare call upon me?" The temple trembled. The air itself seemed to crack under the weight of something unseen. Meritneith did not move, did not breathe. The gods had abandoned her, but death had answered. The temple walls seemed to close in around Meritneith as the voice slithered through the darkness, thick and suffocating like the air before a storm. The shadows twisted at the edges of her vision, shifting unnaturally, coiling into something more than mere absence of light. Then, from the blackness beyond the altar, two golden eyes emerged, gleaming like molten fire. A towering figure stepped forward, his form wavering between man and beast Anubis, the god of death. His jackal head tilted slightly as he observed her, the flickering torchlight reflecting off his sleek, obsidian black fur. His lips curled in something resembling amusement. "A queen who would trade her soul," he mused, his voice smooth as silk, yet laced with something ancient and dangerous. How interesting. Meritneith forced herself to hold his gaze, though her heart pounded like war drums in her chest. She had spent her life fearing the gods, honoring their laws, never daring to stray from the path carved for her. Yet, standing before the god of death himself, she felt no fearingly purpose. "My husband is dying," she said, her voice steady despite the cold that wrapped around her like unseen chains. "My kingdom is falling. I will not watch Kemet turn to dust while the gods do nothing." Anubis stepped closer, his presence drowning out everything else, the scent of incense, the distant hum of the city, even the flickering of the torches. He lifted one clawed hand, and the mark on her palm where she had spilled her own blood began to burn. "Power has a price, mortal," he murmured. "Are you willing to pay it?" Meritneith clenched her fists, ignoring the sting. "Yes." Anubis chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver through her spine. "Then it is done." The temple trembled as the shadows surged forward, wrapping around her, seeping into her skin. The world spun, and for a brief moment, Meritneith saw things she was not meant to see: endless deserts of the afterlife, spirits wandering the dunes, the great scales where souls were weighed. Then, just as suddenly, the visions vanished. The shadows retreated, but their touch remained. The sigil of Anubis burned into her palm, glowing faintly before fading into her skin. "The power you seek is now yours," Anubis said, stepping back into the darkness. "But remember this, Queen of Kemet, when your time comes, I will collect what is mine." Then he was gone. Meritneith staggered, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The temple was silent once more, but she was no longer the same. The weight of her bargain pressed against her chest, but there was no time for regret. She had what she needed. She would save her kingdom, but she had also sealed her fate. The doors of the palace burst open as Meritneith stormed into the pharaoh's chamber. The priests barely had time to bow before she shoved past them, her eyes locked onto the frail figure lying on the bed. Mentuhotep's breath was shallow, his skin nearly translucent beneath the golden sheets. His body had grown so weak that even the weight of the linen seemed too much. The scent of herbs and decay clung to the air. She did not hesitate. Meritneith moved to his side, ignoring the whispers of the priests as she pressed her marked palm against his chest. The sigil of Anubis flared to life, searing with an unnatural heat. The chamber trembled. The torches flickered. The air thickened as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, the pharaoh's body jerked. A strangled gasp escaped his lips, his back arching as his eyes flew open, not weak, not clouded with sickness, but sharp, glowing with something unearthly. The priests staggered back in shock, murmuring prayers under their breath. Neferua's heart raced. She had done it. Mentuhotep's gaze locked onto hers, confusion flickering across his face. Then he sat up, stronger than before. His skin no longer held the sickly pallor of death, his breath steady and full. But as Meritneith reached for his hand, a chill passed through her. His fingers felt wrong, too cold, too strong. She dismissed the feeling. She had brought him back. That was all that mattered. The news spread through the kingdom. Like wildfire, Pharaoh Mentuhotep had risen from his deathbed, stronger than ever. The people rejoiced. Temples were filled with offerings, and the high priests praised Meritneith as a queen blessed by the gods. They did not question how she had done it. They only saw the miracle. With her husband restored, Meritneith wasted no time. She used her newfound power to strengthen Kemet's armies, forging alliances with the warlords who had once threatened their borders. Whispers spread of a queen who walked with the favor of the gods, whose enemies fell before her with unnatural ease. In battle, she seemed untouchable. Her enemies struck down before they could even lift their weapons. Her people called her a savior. But in the shadows, the whispers began to change. The priests noticed at first the way the temple statues seemed to flinch in her presence, the way the sacred fires dimmed when she entered. Some claimed they saw shadows moving around her, twisting unnaturally, curling toward her touch. Others swore her reflection flickered in the pools of holy water, her face momentarily becoming something else. And then there was the pharaoh. At first, Mentuhotep was, as he had always been, strong, commanding, the ruler his people adored. But slowly, he began to change. His voice grew colder, his temper sharper. He no longer smiled as he once did, no longer held Meritneith the same way. At night, she would wake to find him standing at the balcony, staring at the stars without blinking, unmoving for hours. Something was wrong. Meritneith could feel it, the weight of the magic, the cold touch of the shadows clinging to her soul. She had done what she set out to do. She had saved her husband. She had saved Kemet. But she had also invited something into her life that would never leave. The priest had begun to watch her carefully, whispering prayers behind her back. The temple doors, once open to her at all hours, now closed earlier, as if they feared her presence. The people still bowed before her, but there was something new in their eyes. Not just reverence, fear. And then one night, she awoke to the sound of whispers. Not from the palace halls, not from the priests, but from the darkness itself. The mark of Anubis burned on her palm, and in the silence of her chamber, a voice curled around her ears like smoke. "Your time is coming, Queen of Kemet." Meritneith closed her eyes, trying to push the voice away, but she already knew the truth. She had made a bargain with death, and death always collects its due. The first sign of the gods' anger came with the sky itself. A thick, unnatural darkness swallowed the sun, casting an eerie twilight over Kemet at midday. The high priests of Ra gathered in the great temple, their voices rising in desperate prayers, but no divine answer came. The sacred fires flickered and died on their own, leaving behind nothing but cold embers. The people whispered of omens of a queen who had defied the natural order, of a curse that had seeped into the very bones of the kingdom. Then came the pronouncement. Before the assembled court, the high priest of Ra stepped forward, his voice trembling with both fear and fury. "The gods have turned against us," he declared. His weathered hands trembled as he pointed directly at Neferura. "Our queen walks with death itself. She has brought darkness upon Kemet. She has defied the will of the gods." The court fell into stunned silence. Meritneith stood tall, her golden headdress gleaming even in the dim light, her expression unreadable. The nobles and warriors shifted uneasily, torn between loyalty and the fear curling in their hearts. She had saved them, but at what cost? Meritneith did not flinch. She met the priest's gaze with cold determination. "The gods abandoned us first," she said, her voice ringing through the halls. "When my husband lay dying, they did nothing. When Kemet fell into ruin, they remained silent. I did what had to be done." A murmur swept through the courtroom in agreement, others in horror. But the high priest's voice rose above them all. "You have bound yourself to the god of the dead. You have defiled the sacred balance. You are no longer our queen. You are an abomination." The words struck like a blade. Neferura's fingers curled into fists, but before she could respond, a deep, unearthly rumble shook the palace. A cold wind rushed through the halls, extinguishing the torches. The gods had heard the accusation, and they had answered. That night, Meritneith found her husband standing by the great palace balcony, unmoving. The golden jewelry adorning his arms caught the dim torchlight, but his face remained hidden in shadow. She stepped closer. "Mentuhotep?" Slowly, he turned. The moment she saw his face, she froze. His eyes, once warm, once full of life, were black. Not dark, not shadowed empty, void of anything human. His skin, once rich with the warmth of the sun, had taken on a pale grayish hue, stretched too tightly over his bones. He had always been a man of presence, a ruler whose very stance commanded respect. But now he looked like something else, something that did not belong to this world. Meritneith took a step back. What is happening to you?" The pharaoh's lips parted, but the voice that came out was not his. It was layered, hollow, as if multiple voices spoke through him at once. "I was never truly restored." His lips curled into something that was not a smile. "I was claimed." A chill swept through Neferura's bones. She had brought him back from death, but she had not returned him. Her stomach twisted. She had made a terrible mistake. The following days were filled with tension so thick it suffocated the air. The nobles and generals who had once stood unwaveringly by her side now kept their distance. The priests avoided her gaze entirely. Even the servants scurried through the palace halls like frightened mice. The whispers had grown louder. The people had begun to fear her. Meritneith could sense it the way their eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long. The hushed conversations that ended abruptly whenever she entered a room. But what she did not expect was betrayal. Late one night, as she walked the empty halls of the palace, she felt a shift in the air, a presence that did not belong. The flickering torches cast long, distorted shadows, stretching unnaturally against the stone walls. Then, a sound, the faint shuffle of feet. She turned just as a dagger sliced through the air toward her throat. Instinct took over. Before she could even think, her body moved. Shadows surged around her, twisting, coiling like living things. The blade never reached her skin. It stopped midair, held by an unseen force. The assassin's eyes widened in horror. Then, the shadows lunged. The man let out a strangled scream as the darkness wrapped around him, seeping into his flesh, draining the life from his body before he could even fall to the ground. The torches in the hall sputtered, their light dimming as Meritneith lowered her trembling hand. She looked down at her palm. The sigil of Anubis burned cold. The power was no longer something she controlled. It was something that lived within her. The attack was only the beginning. The court had turned against her, and now the gods themselves would act. The next morning, the sky darkened before the sun had fully risen. A thick mist rolled through the city, curling through the streets like a serpent, pressing against the doors and windows of the temples. Statues of the gods cracked and crumbled, their once divine faces shattering into dust. The people fell to their knees, wailing, crying out for forgiveness, but there was no answer. And then the ground trembled. Meritneith stood at the balcony of the palace, staring down at her city, her heart pounding as the temple spires split apart, their foundations crumbling as if the gods themselves had struck them down. A cold gust of wind howled through the streets, carrying the whispers of voices she could not understand. Then she felt him, a presence older than time itself, a weight pressing against her very soul. Meritneith turned, and there, standing in the shadows of her own throne room, was Anubis. His jackal eyes gleamed in the dim light, amusement flickering in their golden depths. He took one slow step forward, the air around him twisting unnaturally. "Did you think you could escape your fate, Queen of Kemet?" His voice was calm, but beneath it lay something sharp, something final. Meritneith clenched her fists. "I did what had to be done. My people live. My husband lives." Anubis tilted his head slightly. "Your husband is a corpse wearing borrowed flesh. Your people worship a queen who no longer belongs to this world." His gaze darkened. "Your time is up." The temple walls groaned, the very air trembling. The gods had allowed her defiance long enough. But Meritneith would not surrender so easily. She ran, not out of cowardice, not out of fear, but because she knew if there was even the smallest chance to break this curse, to save herself, she had to try. She fled into the sacred tombs, the oldest part of the city, where the great kings of the past had been laid to rest. Beneath the earth, away from the eyes of gods and men, she searched for something that could undo what had been done. The Book of Thoth, legendary text that held the knowledge of the gods, the one thing that could grant her power equal to the divine. If she could find it, if she could read its words, perhaps she could fight back. But as she reached the deepest chamber of the tomb, her breath came in sharp gasps, her vision blurred. A shadow loomed behind her. A cold hand rested upon her shoulder. And then, a whisper, "You cannot escape me." Meritneith turned slowly, her breath caught in her throat. Anubis stood behind her, his jackal eyes gleaming with cold amusement. The air around him was thick with shadows, swirling and shifting like a living thing. The tomb's stone walls trembled under his presence, the ancient hieroglyphs flickering as if whispering forgotten secrets. "You cannot escape me, Queen of Kemet," he murmured, his voice wrapping around her like the chill of the afterlife. Meritneith swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall. "I will not surrender," she said, though her voice wavered. "I have come for the Book of Thoth. I will undo this curse. I will break this fate." Anubis chuckled, a low sound that sent a shiver through her bones. "You still believe you have a choice?" He took a slow step forward, and the very air grew heavier. "There is no undoing what has been done. You called upon me, you made the bargain. And now I have come to collect." Meritneith clenched her fists. I did what I had to do. My people live because of me. My kingdom still stands." "And yet," Anubis said softly, tilting his head, "you do not." For the first time, Meritneith truly felt it. The weight pressing against her chest, the cold threading through her veins, the whisper of the shadows curling at her feet. She had been changing slowly, gradually, but now, standing before Anubis, the truth was undeniable. She was no longer fully of this world. The god of death extended a hand toward her, his clawed fingers open in invitation. "Come willingly," he offered, his voice almost gentle, "and I will spare Kemet from the wrath of the gods. Your people will not suffer for your sins." Neferura's breath caught. The choice lay before her, her soul, or her kingdom. Her heart pounded as she stepped back, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. Then louder, "Number, I will not bow to you." Anubis exhaled sharply, not in anger, but in amusement. "So be it." The shadows lurched forward. Meritneith threw her hands out, summoning the power that had become part of her. The darkness at her feet responded, coiling around her, not as an enemy, but as a weapon. The tomb trembled as she struck back. The battle that followed shook the underworld itself. Anubis was faster than anything mortal, faster than anything she had ever faced. He moved like the wind, like a shadow without form, his strikes cutting through the air with terrifying precision. But Meritneith had not made a deal with death without learning its power. She fought like a storm, wielding the very darkness he had given her against him. The tomb walls cracked. Ancient dust filled the air. The whispers of spirits swirled around them, watching, waiting. Meritneith dodged a strike, her heart pounding, her body burning with energy not her own. For a moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, she could win. But then, the shadows betrayed her. Anubis lifted a hand, and the darkness turned against her. The tendrils of shadow that had obeyed her moments ago now wrapped around her wrists, her ankles, her throat. They dragged her to her knees, forcing her to the cold, unyielding stone. She gasped, struggling, but it was useless. The magic was not hers. It had never been hers. It had always belonged to him. Anubis stepped closer, gazing down at her with something that might have been pity. "You cannot fight what you have become." Meritneith screamed in frustration, in anger, in defiance. And then, she did the only thing left to do. The sacrifice that saves a kingdom. With her last ounce of strength, Meritneith let go. She stopped struggling, stopped resisting. Instead, she focused. She had made a deal with death. But she was still a queen. And if she could not save herself, she would save her people. Drawing in a final, shuddering breath, she spoke words that had never been uttered before. Not in this world, not in the afterlife. Words whispered to her from the depths of the underworld itself. The shadows froze. The air grew still. Even Anubis hesitated. And then a pulse of power. The sigil on Neferura's palm flared, not with cold, but with light. The magic she had been given, the darkness, the curse, she turned it inward. She pulled it all back into herself. Every tendril, every shadow, every ounce of death that had seeped into her soul. Her body convulsed, her vision blurred. The pain was unimaginable, and then silent. Anubis watched as the shadows slowly unraveled from her, pulling away, dissolving into nothing. Meritneith slumped forward, her breath ragged, her body weak. She had done it. She had taken the curse into herself. Kemet was free. Anubis knelt before her, watching as her life faded. His golden eyes held something unreadable. "You are not like the others," he murmured. "You do not beg. You do not run. You choose. Meritneith barely managed a smile. A queen always chooses. And with that, she was gone. The sun rose over Kemet the next morning, brighter than it had in years. The black mist that had strangled the land was gone. The statues of the gods, once broken, stood whole once more. The pharaoh, freed from his unnatural existence, crumbled to dust. The people wept, mourning their lost king. But they would never know the true price that had been paid. No one spoke of Meritneith again. Her name was wiped from the records, her image erased from the walls of the temples. It was as if she had never existed. But in the quiet places, in the whispers of the wind, and the flicker of the temple torches, the story remained. The tale of the queen who had made a deal with Death Hand, in the end, had outwitted even the gods. They say on the darkest nights, when the desert wind howls through the tombs, a shadow lingers just beyond the torchlight, watching, waiting. And if you listen closely, you might hear a whisper. A queen always chooses. In the heart of ancient Egypt, beneath the scorching desert sun, an old and wise seer stood before the pharaoh's grand palace. Her eyes, clouded with age, yet sharp with a knowledge few could comprehend, glistened with fear as she spoke the prophecy that would change the course of history. "A boy will rise," she whispered. "A boy who will kill his father and marry his own mother." Her voice trembled with an ominous energy as she repeated the chilling words. "A curse that no one can escape." Those who gathered in the royal court, from noblemen to slaves, felt their hearts freeze with terror. The air became thick with unease, as if the very heavens themselves had cursed the land. The prophecy, strange and horrific, echoed in the minds of all who heard it, leaving a scar on Egypt's fate that would never heal. The pharaoh, a man whose power and wealth had once seemed infinite, now stood shaken before the words of the seer. His kingdom had prospered for centuries, built on the backs of countless slaves and the wisdom of the gods. But now it seemed as though the gods themselves had turned against him. His newborn son, the heir to the throne, would one day be the cause of his ruin. The pharaoh could not allow that to happen. In the quiet of the palace chambers, he turned to his trusted advisors, his hands trembling as he gripped the royal scepter. "This must not come to pass," he muttered, his voice thick with sorrow. "I will do whatever it takes to ensure that the prophecy is stopped before it can unfold." The decision was made in a heartbeat. The infant, so innocent and pure, would be abandoned, cast away, to die, so that the curse could never be fulfilled. But deep within the pharaoh's heart, a painful truth began to stir. The gods had already set this tragedy in motion, and no man, no king, could change what was written in the stars. The boy's fate was sealed. Under the cover of darkness, the pharaoh ordered his son to be taken far from the royal palace. Wrapped in a simple cloth, the child was placed in a small basket and left on the banks of the Nile River. The river's current would carry him away, and with it, the hope for the kingdom's future. The pharaoh, haunted by his decision, could not bear to look as his son was carried away, knowing that the life of the innocent child would be snuffed out before it could truly begin. Yet fate had other plans. As the basket floated gently down the river, the gods, it seemed, had decided that this boy's life would not end here. The very same river that had been meant to drown him, instead, became the cradle that saved him. The child was discovered by a band of travelers, unaware of the boy's royal heritage, who took him in as their own. And so, the prophecy, though seemingly halted, continued to live in the shadows, waiting for the day it would come to fruition. The child, once destined for a life of royalty, grew up in a modest home far from the grandeur of the pharaoh's palace. Raised by the kind-hearted travelers who had found him by the Nile, he knew nothing of his true origins. His days were spent in the simple routines of farm life, helping with crops, tending animals, and learning the ways of the world from those who took him in as their own. Yet, despite the love and care they gave him, something inside the boy always felt incomplete. He was different from the others. The other children in the village, though friendly and kind, could never quite understand him. There was a restlessness in his heart that none could explain. His dreams, vivid and haunting, often filled his nights. He saw visions of a grand palace, of golden thrones, and the faces of people who looked at him as though they knew him, yet he did not recognize them. He would wake with a sense of longing, as though something important was missing from his life. Though he loved his adoptive family, deep within him stirred the quiet whisper of a destiny he could not yet comprehend. The seer's prophecy seemed a distant shadow in his mind, one he couldn't quite grasp but which seemed to follow him, always lurking just beyond the edge of his consciousness. As he grew older, the boy's strange dreams began to intensify. In these dreams, he stood before a grand throne room, bathed in golden light, surrounded by people who cheered his name, and yet he was always alone. There were faces in the crowd, figures that seemed familiar, but they were always blurred, their features just out of reach. At times he felt the strong pull of an unseen force, as though something was guiding him, pulling him towards this mysterious palace. He would wake from these dreams, gasping for air, his heart racing as if the very air around him was thick with the scent of power. It wasn't just the dreams that troubled him. There was a strange pull to Egypt itself. Though he had never been there, he felt an inexplicable connection to the land of the pharaohs. In every passing breeze, in the whispers of the wind through the trees, he felt a connection, deep and undeniable. He would hear stories of Egypt, of its ancient kings and their magnificent pyramids, and his heart would ache as though he knew them, though he had never set foot on the sacred sands. The boy, now a young man, began to realize that he could not ignore these feelings any longer. Something within him urged him to leave his humble life behind and seek the kingdom he had never known but felt he belonged to. His destiny, though hidden, was beginning to call out to him. The day finally came when the boy could no longer ignore the pull of his heart. One evening, as he sat by the fire, listening to his adoptive father's tales of distant lands and forgotten kingdoms, a strange feeling overcame him. The firelight danced on the walls, casting shadows that seemed to take on lives of their own. In that moment, he knew that he could not remain in the village any longer. His soul was restless, and the dreams, those vivid, haunting dreams, were no longer just whispers. They were becoming a roar, demanding his attention. He had to go to Egypt. He had to find the truth about himself. His adoptive parents, though sad to see him go, understood that they could not stand in the way of the path he was meant to take. With nothing but the clothes on his back and a small pouch of coins, the boy, now a young man, set off on the journey that would change his life forever. As he traveled, each step seemed to bring him closer to the land he had dreamed of. The desert winds whispered of Egypt's ancient mysteries, and the more he journeyed, the more he knew that he was headed towards something fateful. The prophecy, still a distant echo in the back of his mind, seemed to grow louder, as if the universe was beginning to align, setting him on the path he had no choice but to follow. After weeks of traveling, the young man finally arrived at the borders of Egypt. The land was unlike any he had ever seen, vast stretches of desert, broken only by the towering pyramids that rose like ancient sentinels against the clear blue sky. The air smelled different, thick with the scent of mystery and power. As he ventured deeper into the kingdom, He was struck by the grandeur of it all. The streets were lined with monumental statues, and the hustle and bustle of the city was unlike anything he had experienced in his small village. He walked among the people, marveling at their rich culture, their clothing, and the majestic architecture that surrounded him. Yet, even as he took in the beauty and grandeur of Egypt, he felt an undeniable sense of belonging. This was his place, and it was here that he would uncover the truth of his past. The very air seemed to hum with an ancient energy, as though the land itself was alive with the power of history. The young man was drawn to the palace, a place where he felt an almost magnetic pull. Little did he know, the kingdom was on the verge of a great crisis, and his arrival would set in motion events that would change the course of Egypt's future forever. The prophecy, buried deep within the past, was about to become a reality, and the young man would soon learn that his destiny was tied to the kingdom in ways he could never have imagined. Egypt, once a land of prosperity and peace, was now shrouded in chaos. The pharaoh's kingdom, ruled with an iron fist, was on the brink of collapse. A curse, ancient and powerful, had descended upon the land. Crops failed, the rivers ran dry, and disease spread across the villages like wildfire. The people whispered in fear, their voices trembling as they spoke of the great disaster that had befallen their kingdom. The curse, they said, could only be broken by solving the riddle of the Sphinx, a mythical creature whose riddles were said to be unsolvable. But no one had managed to solve it. The pharaoh, desperate and cornered by his people's fear, issued a proclamation. Whoever could solve the Sphinx's riddle would not only save the kingdom, but be rewarded with riches beyond imagination. The Sphinx, a terrifying creature with the body of a lion and the head of a human, stood guard over the city, waiting for someone to unlock the secret that held the kingdom's fate in its claws. Yet, as time passed, hope faded. The once proud and mighty kingdom now seemed doomed, with every attempt to solve the riddle ending in failure. The people's faith in their rulers began to crumble, and whispers of revolution began to spread. It was in the midst of this turmoil that the young man, still unaware of his true identity, entered the kingdom. His arrival was like a beacon of hope in a land consumed by darkness. As the young man wandered through the streets of Egypt, he soon heard the rumors about the Sphinx. The majestic creature had stood for centuries, guarding the city's secrets, and now it held the key to Egypt's salvation. He was told of the riddle that had puzzled the greatest minds of the kingdom, a puzzle so complex that no one had been able to solve it in generations. The Sphinx's challenge had become the stuff of legend, its riddle a symbol of the kingdom's despair. It was said that anyone who could answer the riddle would gain the right to rule the land and break the curse that had plagued them all. The young man, driven by a sense of destiny, made his way toward the Sphinx. When he arrived, the creature towered before him, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, as if it were waiting for him. The air grew thick with tension as he approached. The Sphinx, its voice like thunder, recited the riddle. I am not alive, but I grow. I do not have lungs, but I need air. I do not have a mouth, but water kills me. What am I? The crowd that had gathered around the Sphinx held their breath. The riddle was not just a test of intellect, it was a test of fate. The young man stood silently, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the puzzle before him. He could feel the weight of the kingdom's hopes resting on his shoulders, the eyes of the people fixed on him with desperate expectation. And then, with a sudden burst of clarity, the answer came to him. Fire, he said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming pressure. The Sphinx's eyes flashed, and for a moment, there was a tense silence. Then, without warning, The creature lowered its head, acknowledging his victory. As the Sphinx bowed its head in recognition, the crowd erupted in cheers. The young man stood still, his heart racing, as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The curse that had plagued the kingdom for so long was finally broken. The sky seemed to clear, the sun shining brighter than ever before. The river, once dry and stagnant, now flowed with life, its waters rushing through the city's streets as if in celebration. The young man, now hailed as a hero, felt a rush of emotions he could hardly comprehend. He had not come to Egypt for fame or glory, but fate had led him here. He had solved the riddle, a task that no one else had been able to complete. As the people of Egypt celebrated, he was approached by a group of the pharaoh's advisors. They praised him for his wisdom and courage, offering him riches and titles in return for his service to the kingdom. But it was not wealth or power that caught the young man's attention, it was the queen. She had been watching from a distance, her eyes locked onto his with a look of admiration and something else, something deeper. The queen, a woman known for her beauty, intelligence, and strength, approached him, her presence commanding the attention of all around her. She offered him a gift, a token of the pharaoh's gratitude for his bravery. But the young man, still overwhelmed by the events that had transpired, could not have known that this was just the beginning. The queen's admiration for him would soon blossom into something far more complicated, something that would change the course of his life forever. As the celebrations continued, the queen took the young man aside, her eyes glinting with a mysterious light. "You have saved us all," she said, her voice smooth and full of gratitude. "The curse is broken, and Egypt is forever in your debt." The young man felt a sense of pride swell in his chest, though he remained humble in the face of such praise. "I did not seek reward," he replied, his voice steady. "I only sought to do what was right for the people of Egypt." The queen smiled at him, her gaze softening with warmth. "And for that, you deserve more than thanks," she said, her words laced with an unspoken promise. "You are now the hero of Egypt, and I offer you a place by my side, not just as a hero but as a partner, to rule this kingdom with me." The young man was taken aback. The offer was more than he had ever dreamed. To rule Egypt alongside its powerful and intelligent queen was a reward beyond his wildest imagination. Yet, despite the honor of the offer, something within him hesitated. There was a strange, unshakable feeling deep in his heart, a sense of destiny that told him this offer was not as simple as it seemed. The queen's eyes held a hidden depth, one that he could not yet understand. The very fabric of his life, which had already been turned upside down by the riddle and the curse, now seemed to twist further with this unexpected offer. What he did not know was that the queen, too, was unaware of the dark truth that lay hidden in their union. In the coming days, their bond would grow stronger, and the boy, now a man, would find himself entwined in a fate he could not escape. A fate tied to the prophecy that had haunted Egypt for generations. With the curse lifted and the kingdom restored to its former glory, Egypt flourished. The people rejoiced, for their land was once again fertile. The Nile flowed abundantly, and the shadows of fear and despair had been dispelled. The grand palace was the center of all celebrations, and the streets were filled with music, laughter, and vibrant colors. The young man, now a celebrated hero, stood by the pharaoh's side, basking in the adoration of the people. His marriage to the queen was a momentous occasion, the news spreading like wildfire across the kingdom. As he walked through the grand halls, the young man felt a sense of pride and fulfillment. He had done something no one thought possible, and now he stood beside the most powerful woman in Egypt, the queen, radiant in her beauty and grace. looked at him with warmth, her eyes full of admiration and love. Yet, despite the celebrations, the young man could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. There was a strange sense of unease in his heart, a nagging feeling that he could not quite explain. He had solved the riddle, broken the curse, and won the queen's favor. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. But deep inside, something felt wrong, as if an unseen truth was lurking just out of reach, waiting to be uncovered. The young man's unease grew as the days passed, and it became impossible to ignore. In quiet moments, when the celebrations subsided, he found himself lost in thought, questioning the strange connection he felt to Egypt. He began to wonder about his past, this true heritage. The queen, always by his side, had been kind and supportive, but something about her presence triggered a deep sense of familiarity that he could not explain. One evening, as they sat alone in the palace, the young man finally voiced his concerns. "My queen," he began cautiously, "I must confess, I feel a strange pull within me. It is as if I have known you for much longer than I can recall. There is something about you, something familiar." The queen, though taken aback, smiled softly, her eyes distant. "Perhaps you are simply feeling the weight of your destiny," she replied, her voice laced with a hint of sadness. But the young man could not be satisfied with this answer. His mind continued to race, and as the days passed, his unease turned into obsession. He sought out the palace's high priest, a man who had served the pharaoh for many years and was deeply knowledgeable about the kingdom's history. The priest, an old and wise man, had known the young man's true identity for some time, though he had kept the secret. When the young man approached him with his questions, the priest hesitated, his face filled with sorrow. "You must know the truth," the priest said, his voice heavy with regret. "You are not just any man, my child. You are the pharaoh's son." The words hit the young man like a thunderbolt. He staggered back, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. The priest continued, his voice filled with sorrow. "You were abandoned as an infant. Your life, a secret to protect you from a terrible prophecy that foretold you would kill your father and marry your mother. The truth was out, and it was more horrific than anything the young man could have ever imagined." The world seemed to come crashing down around him as the priest's words echoed in his mind. The young man stumbled backward, his legs trembling, as he struggled to understand the depth of what he had just learned. His father, the pharaoh, was not just a distant ruler. He was the very man he had unknowingly replaced. The queen, the woman he had married, was his mother. He had killed his father by unknowingly fulfilling the prophecy that had been set into motion the moment of his birth. The weight of the truth was suffocating, and the young man could barely breathe. His hands shook as the memories of his journey through dreams, the strange pull to Egypt, the connection to the palace began to align with the grim reality of the prophecy. The gods, it seemed, had planned his life from the very beginning. His destiny had been written long before he could understand it, and now it was too late to undo the damage. He had killed his father by solving the riddle and fulfilling the curse that had haunted Egypt for so long. The realization crushed him. He had been a hero to the people, a savior of the kingdom. But now he was nothing more than a tragic figure, a pawn in a game of fate that he could not escape. The queen, unaware of her own connection to him, had accepted him as her husband, not knowing that he was her son. And now they were bound together by a marriage that had been destined to bring about the fulfillment of the darkest prophecy. The young man fell to his knees, his heart breaking as he realized the true horror of his actions. He had murdered his father, married his mother, and in doing so had become the living embodiment of the curse that had plagued the kingdom for so long. His tears fell freely as he whispered to the gods, asking for forgiveness, but he knew deep down that no redemption was possible. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and there was no escaping the consequences. The young man's anguish was unbearable as the truth began to settle in his heart. The weight of the prophecy, the horror of what he had unknowingly done, crushed him completely. His mind raced, but he could not escape the devastating reality. The queen, his mother, was still unaware of the truth, and he could not bring himself to tell her. He could not bear to see the look of horror in her eyes when she learned that the man she had married was her own son. But fate, it seemed, would not allow him to remain silent. The revelation spread quickly throughout the palace. Whispers filled the corridors, and soon the truth reached the queen's ears. Her eyes, once filled with love and admiration for her husband, now reflected a deep, horrific disbelief. She turned to him, her voice trembling with shock and horror. "No," she whispered, her face paling as she struggled to comprehend what she had just learned. "It cannot be true." The young man could barely look her in the eyes as the full weight of the truth crashed down upon them both. The queen collapsed in despair, her knees buckling beneath her as she fell to the floor in grief. The people of the kingdom, who had once hailed him as a hero, now viewed him with fear and disgust. The fulfillment of the prophecy had shattered the lives of all involved. The young man, overwhelmed by shame and guilt, could not escape the reality of his fate. His actions had led to the destruction of everything he had worked for the love of his mother, the kingdom's prosperity, and his own soul. He had unknowingly destroyed the very foundation of his world, and now there was no way to undo the damage. The news of the young man's true identity spread like wildfire throughout the kingdom, quickly reaching every corner of Egypt. The once joyous streets, filled with music and celebration, now lay silent, echoing only the whispers of a dark truth. The people, who had hailed him as their savior, now looked upon him with horror and fear. The curse that had once gripped their land had been broken, but the fulfillment of the prophecy had brought a new, deeper sorrow. The young man had killed his father, the pharaoh, and married his own mother, unknowingly bringing about the very tragedy that had been foretold. The joyous celebrations for his heroism turned into a funeral procession for the kingdom's lost innocence. In every home, the people mourned not just the loss of their king, but the loss of the future they had once hoped for. The young man's heart, once filled with pride and accomplishment, now felt hollow with the weight of his actions. The kingdom that had once adored him now cast him aside as a tragic figure, a symbol of fate's cruel and inescapable grip. Even the mighty pharaoh's palace, once a place of opulence and splendor, seemed to weep with the realization that everything they had fought for had been in vain. The people's mourning was not just for the king's death, but for the death of their hopes, their future, and the kingdom's very soul. The young man wandered through the palace, his steps heavy and slow, as if the weight of his own destiny was dragging him down. The truth of his actions weighed on him like 1,000 stones, each one more crushing than the last. His mind was in turmoil, had done everything he thought was right, had lifted the curse, had saved the kingdom, and yet, in the end, he had fulfilled the prophecy that had destroyed his life. He had killed his father, unknowingly married his mother, and brought tragedy to the land he had tried so hard to save. The faces of the people he had once admired and protected now seemed distant, almost accusatory. The cheers of victory had turned to whispers of shame. He could no longer stay in a kingdom that no longer saw him as a hero. but as the embodiment of the curse that had consumed them all. The young man made a decision that tore at the very core of his being: would leave Egypt. He would go far from the palace, far from the land that had once been his home, and live out his days in solitude, away from the memories of his past and the people who could never forgive him. His heart ached as he thought of the queen, his mother, who was now trapped in a sorrow that would never fade. The kingdom's mourning would be her eternal burden, and his departure would be the only way to spare her from the constant reminder of what had been lost. He could not bear to stay and face the people's scorn, nor could he remain by her side and add to the weight of her grief. The decision was made, but as he left the palace behind, the young man could not escape the feeling that his fate had already been sealed, no matter where he went. The queen, who had once stood by the young man's side in love and admiration, now faced a fate far worse than she could have ever imagined. The truth had shattered her world. The man she had married, the man who had become her king, was her son. Her heart ached with grief and disbelief, torn between the love of a mother and the responsibilities of a queen. The weight of the prophecy had not only destroyed her family, but had cast a dark shadow over the future of the kingdom. She was left with a broken heart, trapped between the love for the son she had unknowingly born into the world and the duties of her position as queen. The palace, once filled with warmth and celebration, was now a cold, desolate place, reflecting her own inner turmoil. She had lost the love of her life, the father of her son, and now she was forced to face a truth she could never escape. The guilt and sorrow consumed her. The kingdom had lost its hope, and the queen's heart had been shattered by the revelation of the terrible prophecy. She would forever be known as the mother who married her own son, and no matter what she did, she could never escape the consequences of that fate. The queen's reign, like the young man's, would end in tragedy. She would carry the burden of this dark truth until her final breath, forever haunted by the memory of the curse that had torn her family and her kingdom apart. As the young man journeyed away from the kingdom, the weight of his decisions gnawed at him with every step. He had sought to escape the curse that had been placed upon him, but it was clear now that fate was not something that could be outrun. The prophecy had been set into motion long before his birth, and no matter how hard he had fought against it, he could never change the course of his life. The gods had written his destiny, and no amount of courage or wisdom could alter the path they had chosen for him. His heart, once full of hope and pride, now felt hollow, emptied by the knowledge that he had caused the downfall of everything he had ever cared for. He had been a hero, a savior, a symbol of hope, but in the end, he had been nothing more than a pawn in the gods' cruel game. The kingdom he had saved now lay in ruins, and the mother he had unknowingly betrayed would carry the burden of their shared tragedy for the rest of her life. As he walked away from the ruins of his past, the young man knew that he could never escape the price of fate. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and with it, the destruction of everything he had hoped for. The gods, in their cruel wisdom, had shown him that some destinies could never be avoided. He was, in the end, the living proof of the inescapable power of fate.